BC's socialist NDP government is suggesting sweeping changes to the province's Heritage Conservation Act, changes that are adding to the growing concerns on what I call reconciliation overreach. Some of the early stages of that, at least that manifested themselves, were non-Indigenous Canadians in British Columbia being told they're not welcome in public spaces because they're not Indigenous, or more recently, citizens, private landowners, wondering if they'll be kicked off their own land now that the BC Supreme Court has determined they live underneath Aboriginal title. I'm Drea Humphrey with Rebel News. I've been shedding a lot of light on threats to property rights in Canada, whether it be the senseless slaying of ostriches out in Edgewood, British Columbia, or the Richmond and now more recently Kamloops land grab. I haven't quite dived into this important issue, so I'm bringing on a guest who has journalist Odessa Orlowitz with Liberty Talk Canada, and here she is.
Okay, the act is very, very long. So I've looked at what the changes are that everyone is upset about. So what I can say about what it used to be, it used to not have these additions that they want to bring in. But the Heritage Conservation Act has been around since the last time they changed it or made it was the 90s. And that was done by the NDP government. And it's so that if you are building a home or building a development and you come across, with digging and excavating bones or tools of Indigenous from hundreds of years ago, you're supposed to stop and report it. And so it's a permitting program regarding archaeology. But what they're wanting to do, and it's interesting how I found out, there's a realtor who watches my show, and she's actually coincidentally part of the Shoe Swap waterfront residences. So Shoe Swap waterfront group sent out an email and a notice through their website to everybody in the area saying, oh my gosh, look at the changes they want to make to this Heritage Conservation Act. They're calling it the Transformation Project. They want to make it so that now it's not about stumbling upon archaeological artifacts. They want to make it so that to make changes to property or building developments we so desperately need housing or businesses, you now apply for a permit and First Nations or local tribes decide if your area, there's any, it's called intangible cultural heritage, which means that the sites do not have to have any evidence at all. It includes that, and it's pretty much that which cannot be grasped mentally or understood. So in other words, they can just say, nope, in that area, there was a spirit of a bear 600 years ago that, was there. They can say that grandma sung a song over there near your bush, or where you want to build your barn, there was a spirit of an ancestor through them talking about all their, I call them ghost stories at this point, because spirits, ghost stories, what's the difference? So when David Eby is saying he's trying to speed up the permitting process because it's just bottlenecked, people are waiting between 1 and 3 years for permits. There's a whole bunch of companies that I can list off for you that are saying, by you adding intangible cultural heritage, where you now have to ask First Nations, even in cases of private property, in many cases, that you would like to build a barn or sell or buy property, they're going to tell you yes or no based on if they think a spirit resides there or they used to do potlucks there or sing songs.
Well, that's crazy. Let's take a look at a couple of these highlighted changes here on a document put out by journalist Caroline Elliott. All right, so it says formalizing a process for seeking First Nations consent on permitting decisions. So you see that word consent right there. Expand the definition of heritage to include a broader spectrum of First Nations values, including intangible heritage values. So these words like consent and values are not based on science and facts.
No. And in fact, can I quickly read you just a few parts I've pulled out from one of the best letters written? It's really important that we understand what this can do to the BC economy and to home building. Can I read that?
Sure. Who's the letter by?
Okay, so this one, they're all the same. There's like 8 letters I sent you from entities that are important. This one happens to be from the Independent Contractors and Business Association that they wrote, and it's 4,500 construction companies. And they said that they have serious concerns about the Heritage Conservation Act Transformation Project. And they said that our members regularly report that archaeological impact assessments can take up to a year to process, adding significantly to project timelines and increasing costs for families and communities and local businesses. Premier Eby has made it clear that speeding up permitting is a central priority of his government, but these proposed changes will make that goal impossible to achieve, adding more obligations to an already overwhelmed heritage branch will only slow approvals further. Then they say the unworkable concept of intangible heritage. One of the most serious concerns is a proposal to expand the definition of heritage. He says, it is impossible to regulate what cannot be seen or touched. Attempting to apply permitting rules to intangible heritage, such as stories, songs, or traditions, is unworkable and is certain to be a recipe for not only endless debate, but conflict and litigation. Builders cannot be expected to design, price, or plan projects based on undefined, subjective, and non physical criteria. The Oxford English Dictionary notes intangible means something that cannot be touched or grasped mentally. Attempting to embed such an undefined concept into regulation will paralyze the permitting system and expose
Wow.
projects to endless subjective disputes. This proposal, put simply, is a non starter for our industry. And that is one letter out of about 8 I sent you.
Yeah.
Here's a few more. I'm not going to read their letters, but they were just similar. People and entities saying this is insane is the Union of BC Municipalities, the Association of Mineral Exploration, Urban Development Institute, Independent Contractors and Business Associates, Business Council of BC, the Canadian Home Builders Association, Greater Vancouver Board of Trade, and BC Real Estate Association, just to name a few.
And from what I can see, they're unanimous on this, which you don't usually see with unions, etc., businesses. They're saying this is going to be a nightmare. What do you make of what you said earlier here that, David Eby's basically saying we need to do this so that it gives a green light? I mean, the NDP has been so criticized for the amount of red tape when it comes to developments. To me, it almost comes across as, get things so horrible and then you offer some sort of relief and people maybe they expect you to grab it but they're seeing through it.
Well, yeah, he says that what they're trying to do is I looked at what their intended outcome is. It says that instead of dealing with like a bunch of different entities to get your permit, they're going to streamline it more into one, but they're giving more authority and more input to the local tribes. So, you know how they say Ebby's just speaking out of one mouth saying this and doing another thing? It's sort of like, look over here while I sneak this in. And so that's why these groups are saying this is going to make it worse. Now it's not stumbling upon, unfortunately, a bone where you're by law supposed to report it. They literally want to say that you have to apply first to do anything. Then the Indigenous show up and decide if a song was sung there 600 years ago. How do you how do you litigate that? What are you supposed to say when there's no physical evidence? Are you supposed to say to the Indigenous, well, that's not true? I mean, this is insanity.
Well, it really is. And it's, just making me think again of how unfortunate the situation is for those Richmond residents affected by the Aboriginal title claim. Very similar arguments, oral testimonies about canoeing. These are nomad communities, not even necessarily saying they stayed there for long periods of time, but they went through, picked some berries, and
Mhm.
now it's there. So we're seeing that kind of thing here. Imagine again the Aboriginal title thing. Now this, who on earth is going to want to do business here? But just back to those Richmond landowners, their hope is in this appeal, which they're supposed to be looking at the government of Canada and the BC government as defending them. We've already seen both the AG of Canada and BC block one of the strongest arguments, the Aboriginal title extinguishment argument. So that's already had red flags. But if you look at David Eby, when you say talking over here, saying one thing and another, remember when he was trying to do sweeping changes to the Land Act and the public caught on that? There was a lot of pushback. So they kind of let that one go. And then he went and just gave Haida Gwaii the title agreement anyways. He just bypassed the courts, gave it to them. They got that governing authority, and now half of those islands who are the people that are non-Indigenous are governed by a First Nation band they can't elect. David Eby is certainly not somebody I would want to look at as the person who's going to get me out of this reconciliation overreach trouble. You and I have been talking about UNDRIP for years, and in BC, that was the jurisdiction, the first one in the world to take the UN's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and make it into law, binding
Mhm.
law that we're
Mhm.
seeing played out in many ways now, including this, I would argue.
Well, yes. In fact, sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
it says right on the government website that they are trying to, I use the word inflict, but they're trying to put UNDRIP into the Heritage Conservation Act. And in
Right.
fact, that's what this is. They're putting UNDRIP and DRIPA into it. And so, once again, some bureaucrats from the UN are saying we need to do this. And we haven't even touched on the amount of money and expense that adding this layer of cultural significance or spiritual significance. I have to say, I did a deep dive. This is going to create more money and jobs and more hourly billing for the Indigenous to show up and say, well, was there berry picking over there? Did we do a potluck there 600 years ago? Is there a spirit over there? You know,
Hmm.
Now you have to pay them to show up and do an assessment of that. And all of this costs a lot of money. It's already costing millions and millions to do these archaeological checks. Now you add spiritual checks. This is a ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching for the Indigenous. And so, are they just going to approve it because they're getting money to come and do it? I mean, when people are incentivized to I don't want to say make up stories, but when they need work and they need money, why would they not say, yes, we don't want you to continue your development till we come in and
Hmm.
do a survey when they know they're making a ton of money by doing that? And
And we
you're incentivizing this.
Well, and we should point out it's not even the indigenous necessarily who are going to benefit from this, but rather the banned governments. We've been giving billions of dollars in reconciliation purposes, but a lot of these reserves still have people appearing to live in poverty. I used
Mhm.
to volunteer cleaning reserves, and the living conditions there that are accepted by the banned government, they would be condemned in other places. Of course, that's not all banned governments, but the point is, we're not seeing the effect of all these changes towards reconciliation benefiting the people. It's not lessening how many Indigenous people are in jails. It's not lessening how many of them are addicted and dying. It's not lessening these things. So the jig is really up. But the other thing I'm reminded out about is we see, these land acknowledgements, these compelled ones being said on the behalf of everyone who lives in that region, whether they like it or not, or this, hey, you can't go to this beach because we want to do a ceremony and you're not welcome, and you better be an ally to all of this. If we get your Aboriginal title, you better be an ally or else. It it seems to me that we are learning absolutely nothing from the biggest complaints we would hear about residential schools per se, the claim that they were cultural genocide. Now, if you look at stats up until 2021, most Indigenous Canadians higher than the proportion of the other population considered themselves as Christians. It was in the 60s, but even now it's close to 50%. But now it seems as though the culture of British Columbians is being challenged, and that you have to adopt not even necessarily what maybe all Indigenous people believe, but what I would say is maybe a Marxist globalist agenda using the Indigenous people, while band governments get filthy rich and their lawyers, of course, in the process. Anything else you want to add before we end on this important topic?
No, that's so great that you actually pointed out that, yeah, it's the band governments and chiefs and it's the bureaucrats that are making money. The reconciliation industry is making money, and it's really not doing much for the reserves. So something has to change. And I just have to say that in some of those letters, there were warnings from these businesses, like the mineral explorers, saying, we will not touch BC with this Heritage Conservation Act transformation project the way it is. So we hope that enough people are going to come out and say no to this.
If reconciliation overreach is concerning you, here is a quick and easy way to take action. Go to our special website called endlandgrabs.com and sign and share our petition today.